One of the greatest obstacles to crafting health and wellness is identifying and controlling inflammation. It's at the core of all complex and chronic diseases, and it's the driving mechanism that underlies the most common symptoms that people like you struggle to overcome. Join us as we explore cutting-edge science and research to give you the information and tools you need to create the quality of life you want and deserve. And now, here is the host of Inflammation Nation, Dr. Stephen Noseworthy.
So we have a couple of more topics just to finish off this discussion in this little mini-series on healthy weight loss and the role that inflammation plays. Last episode, we talked about a series of, 15 or so different inflammatory triggers that you really need to be considering if things like diet and exercise are not resulting in the weight loss and the body recomposition that you're looking for. So I've tried my best to give you some targets, some goals, but more so to give you a mental framework of how to organize your thinking and your strategy so that when you get to the point that you start doing things to change how your body looks and feels and functions, then you've got some things that you can actually apply that are practical and effective. So the next thing I want to talk about is really a dovetail off the last discussion, which is about inflammation, because ultimately at the end of the day, all inflammatory triggers try to do one thing, and that is to activate something called NFkB, which is called a nuclear transcription factor that controls the cell's production of inflammatory chemicals like cytokines. So here's how this works, is that you have all of these internal and external stressors. Let's bring our thought process down to the cellular level. And if you remember anything about high school biology, maybe you even took a course or two in college if you went there. But basically you have a cell. Inside the cell is what's called the cytoplasm. And floating around the cytoplasm is something called the nucleus. And inside the nucleus is where you have your DNA. And DNA contains the instructions on how to make things that are relevant to the function and the structure of that particular cell. So the DNA of a muscle cell is going to be a little bit different than the DNA of a liver cell, which is going to be different than the DNA of a brain cell. And there are DNA instructions encoded in immune cells as well. But nevertheless, whether your stressor is an external stressor like external psychological stressors like a bad work environment or a bad relationship, if it is an environmental compound, if it's an internal stressor like an infection, a leaky gut, a blood sugar, or a hormonal imbalances, remember, all of these things can drive inflammation. They all do one thing as they converge down at the cellular level, and that is to encourage this thing called NFkB to go from the cytoplasm, the general interior of the cell, into the nucleus, let's call it the inner sanctum of the cell, where it can bind to what's called a promoter region on the DNA that contains the instructions that says, hey, let's start making inflammatory chemicals. And so this character called NFkB is called or considered to be the final common pathway of all inflammatory triggers, because if we boil down inflammation to one thing, it's activation of NFkB. Now, a couple of things here. Number one is that under normal resting healthy conditions, NFkB is floating around outside of the nucleus in the cytoplasm, and it's attached to something called the inhibitor of kappa B. Now, I don't know who makes up these names. They're not all that creative. Oh, what do we call the thing that inhibits NFkB? Well, let's call it the inhibitor of kappa B. Great, it tells us exactly what it is, but from a naming standpoint, it's not all that creative. But I digress. My point is this, is that how these inflammatory triggers, both from internal and external environments, activate NFkB so it goes inside the nucleus to drive the production of inflammation, is that it disassociates or disconnects the inhibitor from the NFkB molecule. And it's the inhibitor that actually is preventing the NFkB from getting into the nucleus itself. And so once it's liberated from the inhibitor, NFkB then crosses the barrier into the nucleus, binds to the DNA, and basically presses the on switch that says, hey, let's make inflammatory cytokines. Now, when you take anti-inflammatory compounds, like, and this is very common, we see this in nutritional medicine, and certainly I use my own fair share of these compounds, things like turmeric or resveratrol or ginger or boswellia. There's any number of these things. And when we talk about those things in terms of their ability to inhibit inflammation, if I take turmeric, it doesn't change my work circumstance. I'm being a little bit facetious, but you get my point. If I take turmeric, it will not in and of itself get rid of my gut infection or stabilize my blood sugar. It might contribute to things like insulin sensitization, but nevertheless, the effect, the biological effect that these well-known anti-inflammatory compounds have is to inhibit the ability of NFkB to get into the nucleus to drive that genomic or DNA genetic-based transcription or production of inflammatory chemicals. To say it another way, and this is where it gets a little bit geeky, is that when we use anti-inflammatory compounds like turmeric, etc., we are actually inhibiting inflammation, not just at the cell level, but at the genomic level, which is really pretty cool. We have the ability to do that. So let's say that I am someone who is inflamed and I take turmeric and I take enough to actually make a difference, because that's a whole different discussion. How much does it take to control inflammation? And then all of a sudden I'm like, wow, I'm not inflamed. And I take turmeric for a while and then I start feeling pretty good. And then I forget to take it as often, and then I forget to take it altogether. Or maybe I just run out and figure I'll save some money. So I'm not going to, buy turmeric and keep taking it. And then all of a sudden I start feeling my inflammatory symptoms again. Maybe I've got joint pain or stiffness. Maybe it's brain fog. Maybe it's fatigue. And all of a sudden I'm like, well, wait a minute. I thought I controlled my inflammation. Why do I have to go back and take more turmeric? And so I go back and I take turmeric and I take enough to make a difference. And then maybe I stop and I kind of go through the cycle. And if I don't clue into what's actually happening, I convince myself that I have to be on turmeric all the time. Now, there might be a valid and a cogent argument for maybe some anti-aging properties to things like turmeric and resveratrol. Again, whole different discussion. My point is this. Taking anti-inflammatory compounds is a great bridge strategy to improve your symptoms, to improve your quality of life and your function while you are finding and fixing the triggers. Ultimately, at the end of the day, what you want is to control NFkB and the production of inflammation by eliminating, modifying, or controlling the triggers that are driving it. That means doing a survey of all the different things that can drive inflammation and then asking yourself, is this something that's relevant to me as an individual? Do I have an autoimmunity that I don't know about? Or maybe I do and I'm just not controlling the things that trigger it and flare it up. Do I have a leaky infected gut? Do I have food sensitivities yet I continue to eat those things? Is my blood sugar under control? What about my hormone balance? What about my thought patterns? Am I a positive or a negative person? Do I feel happy and loved in general in life? Do I exercise too little? Do I exercise too much? And what about my environmental burden and my ability to detox and really control and get rid of those things? Ultimately, at the end of the day, what you want to do is find and fix the trigger and not necessarily constantly rely on the nutritional approach to dampen the inflammatory cascade, because eventually the trigger is going to win. The dose of turmeric or resveratrol or whatever that used to work in the past is not going to work at some point in the future, because that's a losing proposition. The trigger and the mechanism will always win, and it will always overcome whatever it is you're doing if all you're doing is trying to control the symptomatology. And yes, as great a strategy as it is to be able to control inflammation at the cellular and the DNA level, that only makes sense to do if you are also at the same time controlling your triggers, which means changing your internal and your external environment. So let me put this into the context of weight loss. Again, if you're on a diet in the sense of you're restricting your calories at an appropriate level that is going to encourage weight loss, if you're exercising and are sufficiently active throughout your day to expend enough calories also to encourage weight loss, and it's still not working, then there are issues that relate to something to do with a metabolic fault or a metabolic dysregulation or imbalance, however you want to call it. And you're really obliged to start looking for the triggers and the mechanisms that are driving the inflammation. In the meantime, sure, go ahead and use any of the natural compounds that have been proven by research, as well as years, decades of thousands of clinical practitioners around the world doing these things, controlling inflammatory symptomatology. But controlling symptoms by taking a natural compound is not the same as fixing the root cause. That's the thing that you want to get to. Thank you so much for listening to the Inflammation Nation. If you found this episode valuable, please rate, review, and subscribe to our podcast. Be the first to know when a new episode drops so that you can stay on top of your game. It also helps others like you find the answers they need. And why not head over to my main website, drnoseworthy.com, that's drnoseworthy.com, to explore my personalized functional medicine coaching programs, submit a question to the podcast, maybe take a quiz, or even reach out to me using the contact form that you can find there. We'll see you next time.